Okay, but you're going to talk about the Soviet issue.
Yeah. Okay. One of the issues that occurred in Eastern Europe that had so much to do with engendering or increasing anti-Semitism among Poles was the collaboration between a considerable element of the Jewish population and the Soviets, who came in 1939 to exact their pound of flesh from the Poles. If one recalls, there was an agreement between Hitler and Stalin which divided Poland, and that eastern section between 1939 and June of 1941, when Hitler double-crossed Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union and reclaimed that area back to the Third Reich. That area from 1939 to 41 was under Soviet control. When that area fell under Soviet control, the Polish population there could not help but be angered by that collaboration between many Jews, not all, but many Jews, and the Soviets. They participated in the arrest, the apprehension, and the deportation of Poles to the interior of the Soviet Union, to the various gulags there. Many Poles lost their lives as a direct result of what can only be considered Jewish treason, pure and simple. Property that was owned by the Poles was confiscated, became Jewish. There were even religious institutions that were turned over to Jewish folks, and so forth. So this is an important consideration, because one has got to remember that that information spread throughout German-occupied Poland. People who were already anti-Semitically inclined, naturally they were confirmed in it. Well, what can you expect? This is proof positive. Created problems later too, because you have a constituency of soldiers, Polish soldiers, who were recruited from those very folks who lived in Eastern Poland by the Anders Army. See, there was later an agreement that Stalin, trying to put a good face toward his Western allies, by then he was an ally of the West, and it was agreed to form a Polish army on Soviet territory. And it had to be formed from those Poles who had been seized and had been arrested and in internment camps and what have you. And a lot of those soldiers came into the Anders Army with rather bad feelings toward the Jews in that area, and naturally resented Jewish soldiers in the Polish army. So there was obviously some anti-Semitism there, but when we say that, of course, there was some good reasons for it, that kind of feeling. I would hesitate, that term anti-Semitism is so elastic, it applies almost to everything. I would prefer to say anti-Jewish feeling, rather than put it under the rubric of anti-Semitism, because all these soldiers were not necessarily anti-Semites before this event in Eastern Europe. And what amazes me, and I discussed that in my book, The Forgotten Holocaust, and what amazes me is that the higher authorities of the Polish army in Russia, starting with General Anders, were able to keep a lid on this so well. In general, I would say Polish military authorities, whether they be in Russia, the Anders Army was subsequently withdrawn. Soviet Union, Stalin didn't want them in the Soviet Union, a military force of that nature. And the military authorities in Great Britain, for example, those who participated in the Allied invasion of Normandy and subsequent operations in Western Europe, they did, I think, showed some real leadership here. Most of them, as far as I know, were not anti-Semitic, and if there was anti-Semitism, it certainly, you found it in smaller pockets within various military groups. But I think it was an amazing leadership on the part of the people like General Anders and others, yes.
So could you synopsize that then? There was a lot of resentment in the Polish population of individuals of Jewish descent who were in the occupiers of the Soviet occupation.
Yeah.
Elaborate that a little bit. Touch on it, but I guess see what I have to think in terms of sound bites. Forgive me. I know you just hit on this a lot, but I have to hit it from different angles sometimes. I'm just another kind of a synopsis, sort of the issue at stake here. Hostility by some Poles and many Poles to the Jews who are in the Soviet occupation. Just summarize that up in a few sentences.
Yeah, I think one thing that is clear is that when the Soviet Union took Eastern Poland as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop deal, that many of the Jewish people in Eastern Poland collaborated with the Soviets, and the Soviets, of course, were the second enemy of the Polish people. This became quite evident, and that was to reap terrible dividends later, in the sense that when the Soviets came back to reoccupy that land, accompanying them were Soviet administrators of Jewish background. So what you have is the 39 to 41 period in which this occurred, and then again in 44 and on, in the reoccupation of that area. And so the Poles in that area, 2 times, were witness to the actual persecution, arrest, and execution of Polish people, frequently by Jewish elements, Jewish administrators, Jewish military, and so on.
You bring up a very interesting point about how difficult it was in your book for Poles to save Jews as so-called righteous Gentiles. But you point out the fact that because many Jews are not assimilated to Polish society, this created all the more difficulty for that. Could you elaborate on that fact of assimilation?
Absolutely. Yeah. This whole subject of Polish aid to Jews is really a fascinating one, because perhaps I may preface it by saying that the Polish people were the only people in German-occupied Europe that had the death penalty hanging over their heads if they were to aid Jews. I often ask the question, why? And the only conclusion I can come to is they did that because there must have been substantial aid that the Poles rendered to the Jewish people. Despite that death sentence, they continued to do it. Now, you had a strong minority. I'm not suggesting that all Poles gave aid to Jews. No, there were many Polands here. You had a very impressive, large minority who risked their lives on a daily basis, who provided any number of support services to the Jewish people. That might include everything from temporary shelter to permanent shelter, to clothing, to food, to providing false documentation to those who could pass as Christians. And estimates abound. I said in the Forgotten Holocaust and in Did the Children Cry that a reasonable figure would be about 1 million or so. We'll never know, because one has to factor in this important element. There were more Jews hidden at any given time than survived the war, and likewise those Poles who gave them umbrage. So my guess is that 1 million seems reasonable, but there probably were more than that. Only a fraction of those have been confirmed as righteous Gentiles by Yad Vashem. But Poles are still the leading country memorialized by Yad Vashem. Now, most Poles, I think, try to get through the daily tragedy that they too were experiencing. They were scared, they were intimidated, there wasn't enough food, they didn't know when they might be deported to some work camp, or worse, a concentration camp. If they fell into the category of intelligentsia, then they could pretty well guess that they would be incarcerated and probably shot. So most Poles fell in the category of trying to get through and survive themselves. And they were not amenable to a risk. It was just risky living a daily life in Poland. Then you have, I think, within that grouping, you had what I called, I believe in the book, passive humanitarians. I think most Poles, from what I've been able to deduce from interviews, from the documents, they were definitely sympathetic with the Jewish plight, but they didn't want to take those risks. A few of them now and again might have done some small thing, but in the totality of small things, they add up to big things. For example, there was a story that I documented of a woman who was chaperoning a little Jewish boy out of the ghetto. And they got on this bus right near the ghetto. That bus was loaded with Polish people, 30, 40 people. Everyone knew that woman, and they knew that little Jewish boy, that boy was Jewish. Because one of the telltale signs, if a Jewish youngster had a physiognomy that was very obviously Jewish, perhaps a pronounced nose or something, they would bandage that part of his face. And they knew, Poles knew. And the bus left that station, went on to the next, and one anti-Semite in the crowd yelled out to the woman to get off the bus with her Jewish charge. And the other 40 or 39 people almost unanimously drowned this man out with laughter, with ridicule, and forced him off the bus, so that the bus driver could continue his rounds, and the woman stopped at her designated place and was able to get off the bus and take this youngster to safety. So, all right, would you include those 40 people as part of the people who aided the Jewish people? Well, in a sense, yeah. But how do you document something like that? You know what I mean? It's many of those small, if spontaneous acts of charity, if you will. And those aren't the ones that I'm including in the minute. I'm talking about, long-term support, aid, even if it was sustained short-term, like providing temporary shelter. And I think most Poles are in that category. You had a small element on the right who were anti-Semites, who didn't necessarily collaborate with the Nazis, but they didn't particularly feel any sympathy toward the Jews, probably saw this as profit for them after the war. And then you have the extreme right collaborators who numbered a small percentage of the population. So they're almost off the spectrum. They were so small and infinitesimal in number. So when writers, Holocaust writers, say the Poles were indifferent, I don't believe that is a correct use of the term. Indifference implies that something could have been done to help, but they didn't want to do it. I think it's more accurate to say that it was virtually impossible for most Poles to help Jews, for the simple reason that these Jews were locked up in ghettos. No one could get in and out easily. So there was very little the average Pole could do on their behalf. So I don't think indifference is the word. Another thing here that is relevant is the passivity of the Jewish people. After all, there was no overt evidence on their part to show that they were anything but passive until January, I believe it was, of 1943, when there was an armed, spontaneous kind of opposition to the Germans. And I think that stimulated great hope among those Jews who were prone toward rising up and dealing with the Nazis in some way. And it certainly stimulated, on the Polish side, within the Polish underground, the notion that, yeah, there's some possibilities here that they may actually rise up. And then that's when I think the Polish underground changed their attitude toward the Jews in the sense that, not that they weren't sympathetic, but they were short of arms themselves, and most of the arms were personal. It was not like they had a big supply bin and they could just go and hand those out. These soldiers had their own weapon, and no soldier is going to give up his own weapon. And they were antiquated, old, and they were really inadequate for the needs. And that led ultimately, as you know, to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, in which there were something like 20 to 30 operations on the part of the Polish underground to help them. But the leadership in of the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising knew themselves that this was a statement they were making. There was no hope they were going to liberate themselves from Nazi control, not given the weapons they had. It was a statement that they were going down fighting. And it had an electrifying effect, I think, throughout Poland, in great respect on the part of the Polish people for these Jewish ghetto fighters.
Do you have any knowledge of the Hasidic community and how that influenced anti-Semitism, the seclusionists? Do you have knowledge of that?
That gets more to your point. I know I strayed, but one thing that made it very difficult, obviously, to help Jews was the fact that the Jewish community, long before the Nazis imposed ghettos, they tended to live in clusters, in environs of their own. And the Orthodox community was, of course, non-assimilationist. And they had some extreme views about contact with Jews. There was this notion that prevailed among many of them that if you had too much contact somehow or other, you would become contaminated in a very real spiritual sense.
You said contact with Jews, you meant contact with Gentiles?
Yes, contacts with Gentiles. And the whole lifestyle of these Orthodox Jews was so different, even from other Jews. You had about 10% of the Jewish population had assimilated. And it's interesting that many of those Polish Jews who had become assimilated and integrated within Polish society had many pejorative things to say about what they considered this primitive Orthodox community. And so you had that dynamic going on. In terms of their own salvation at the hands of the Germans, it made it very difficult when you practiced that form of Judaism and wore the garb, obviously, of a Jew. You were easily identifiable. And most Jews didn't know Polish. I know that's a statement I made in the book, and several Holocaust writers took issue with that. But it's a fact. It's documented. Most of them, their language was Yiddish, and they defined themselves as Jews in nationality. not Polish. So I think in bare sociological terms, when you've got a huge community like that, that's non-assimilationist, living within a larger parent, it was a community. In effect, it was like a state within a state. You're going to have problems. You're going to have serious problems, and and one doesn't have to use, terms like anti-Semitism here. You had some legitimate, anti-Polish feeling on the part of them, as you did anti-Jewish feeling on the part of many Poles. So I think that whole dynamic has got to be understood better than it has.
Can we go on a little?
Yeah, a little further on.
Okay. Could you address the issue of anti-Semitism again? Let's revisit that. Because the idea, what were the Jewish activities or beliefs or what have you that activated or aggravated tensions between Poles and Jews? The issue being, many in the Jewish community aren't even interested in the causes of anti-Jewish hostility. And it's just anti-Semitism is a mental disease, and I've seen that, I've heard that too. Could you address some of the issues? You've touched on a couple already, but sort of encapsulate the kind of what would aggravate the Polish people emanating from the Jewish community towards problems between them.
You mean today?
No, I mean back then, back in leading up to World War II.
Okay, I think that before the war, let me say at the outset that the anti-Semitism that did exist in Poland was definitely more economically based. I mean, there was no racial basis to anti-Semitism in Poland, and that made it stand separate and apart from anything approaching what you had in Nazi Germany. And since there was no fascist party worthy of, that had any great following in Poland, you had a group called the Falanga, but they had no great following. You had fascist parties in a lot of the countries around Poland. I think the fact that Poland was going through a period of nationalist revival after World War I, and there's no question that Polish nationalism exacerbated the tensions with the Jews, but likewise, the Jewish community was being bombarded by forces that were quite nationalistic as well. And most of that was contained in Zionism and its various branches, various groupings. And then you had, the left Zionists who were in close collusion, if you will, with communism, with the Soviet Union. And that in itself, since the Soviets were not regarded as friends, obviously, as I said earlier, both the Germans to the west and the Soviets in the east had both made the Poles go through hell at different times in their history. Any organization that would have this outside loyalty, as it were, either to the Soviet Union or, in the case of most Zionists, to the creation of a separate state of Israel. This obviously would exacerbate tensions as well. So I think one has got to understand that conflict, that dynamic between Polish nationalism and Jewish nationalism. And all too frequently in those debates and conflicts at home in Poland, there were conservative Jews, represented by the Aguda party, who said, wait a minute, to their fellow Jews, what are you talking about? We've had literally a utopia in Poland. Yeah, we've had some incidents, but we have our own religious and communal life here. We've not been barred from the Polish parliament. We have rights here, We have a flourishing culture. And that's a part here. In what country but Poland could this kind of thing have taken place, this great renaissance of Yiddish culture, the theater, the movies, the newspapers, and so on. Only in Poland did that occur. So little wonder, I've interviewed Jews for my book, and they look back of course, most of these folks have now passed away, unfortunately, but they look back very fondly on Poland and their experience and their life there and so on. They have not focused on anti-Semitic incidents, which had always been rather exaggerated. I'm not denying they occurred, but again, it's this lack of perspective on the problem. And I think this carries to today. I don't think most Poles who are well-read and versed in the history of Poland would deny that obviously some anti-Semitism existed. What they resent today is the fact that so much of this has been exaggerated, and they also resent the fact that the broader perspective, if you look, and this is the way historians should be looking at things, if you go back since, say, the 13th century, the Statute of Kalisz, when I believe it was Bolesław the Pious gave those enormous rights to the Jewish community, which endured in Poland for centuries. Poland had a longer philo-Semitic history, pro-Jewish history, than they did an anti-Semitic one. As a matter of fact, I don't believe, except for this nationalistic outbreak and tensions that occurred in the interwar year period, that one could say that anti-Semitism was necessarily fundamental to Polish culture, as philo-Semitism was.
This has come up with other commentators too. The issue of commerce and economics in terms, apparently the Jews were middlemen or some between the lords. And do you have any knowledge of that kind of stuff, or at least contextualize the issue of economics and commerce and how that aggravated anti-Semitism? What was the role of the Jewish community in Poland?
Well, the Jews numbered about 10% of the total population, yet in the professions, we're talking about law, medicine, so on, they numbered maybe as high as 25, sometimes 30% in those professions. In interwar year Poland, about 10% of the Polish citizenry were Jewish, and yet they occupied 25 to 30% of some of the key professions, law, medicine, so on. The middle class that Poland had was obviously essentially Jewish, and this is one of the reasons that in earlier Polish history, the Polish kings and nobles brought the Jewish folks in because they had a reputation for their savviness in commerce, and they provided the middle class from days immemorial. So in a nationalistic day, there were those who argued, well, in commerce as well, there was such a Jewish almost monopoly, everything from the small shopkeeper to the industrialist, that it was time to open up the doors and give Poles an opportunity. And that led to a lot of tensions because it led to a lot of boycotts of of Jewish businesses and so on. And some incidents did indeed occur. But this was an opportunity, and quotas, for example, were favored by many, so that the professions would give more of an opportunity to Poles over Jews. And so inevitably this was to lead to an awful lot of stress and tension, and provoke some incidents, to be sure. You know, many of those incidents that occurred were naturally seen in the West as, you know, proof of Polish anti-Semitism, not a product of the conflict of an internal dynamic here that was an inevitable given the disproportionate number of Jews who were in these professions, and in a nationalistic age, Poles wanting to get their own people in there. Even the most nationalistic of parties at that time, the National Democrats, never advocated, doing away with Jewish businesses. They just wanted more Poles to have a more even, I'd say, playing field. And so that very definitely is part of the whole background here the Polish situation as they went on the eve of World War II.
A couple more, please.
Yeah, make it quick. I'm giving out. With this throat of mine is just give me trouble.
Do you need more water?
Yeah, no, that won't help anymore.
Davies, could you discuss the controversy of him losing his tenure or whatever his job?
Yeah. Norman Davies, who most people know, is a distinguished historian from Great Britain who has authored numerous books, and he is still a very prodigious author. He was considered for a chair of history at Stanford University. He was informed by the search committee of that university that he would be offered a chair there, a chair of history. He came over from Great Britain to take his position when he was informed rather abruptly by the Stanford administration to literally pack up and go home, that the offer had been rejected. In the days and months that followed, in years that followed, it became very clear that some people got wind of his imminent appointment and opposed it. Precisely who those individuals were, I don't believe have ever been identified. However, it became clear in the documentation of this incident that his chapter in God's Playground on Poles and Jews, in which he takes a much more balanced, fair-minded view of Polish-Jewish relations, is what got him into trouble with disappointment. Whoever these individuals were, they managed to get to the Board of Trustees and to the leadership of the university and were able to kill that appointment. Even though he got an attorney to fight this, the case dragged on, and incidentally, I don't believe it ever went to court. Ironically, in one of the documents that were served up to him, I guess at what seemed to be the end of this terrible incident, a statement was made to the effect that Davies' scholarship did not measure up to the requirements of Stanford University. The sequel to that is that after he left the United States, he was given an offer to write the Oxford History of Europe. And I think that speaks volumes right there.
Okay, why the issue you didn't touch on exactly there was why? What's the speculation, or what are the facts, and why was he not given this? Why was this position rescinded?
Well, all I can say in that regard, and I've been in communication with Professor Davies, that someone or some group got to the powers that be at Stanford, and they objected to his more sympathetic view of the Poles. I think that's basically what the issue was. And then they tried to denigrate his scholarship, and of course this was, had no foundation whatsoever, and I believe that was really the basis of it all.
Is there any evidence or facts about Zionists or a Jewish element or anything? Nobody knows exactly.
Nobody knows for certain, but he made a studied point of telling me that two of his supporters who had gone public on this were Jewish people, or Jewish background. And one, I believe, was connected with the Board of Trustees. I don't know that for certainty, but I believe he was highly placed. So, and for two Jewish individuals of some stature to go public on this, I think it was really an act of courage, because most wouldn't do that. I was privileged to be asked to lend my support to him, which I did in 2 letters to the chancellor at Stanford, and I never received any. I received some token replies, but nothing of any substance.
So the circumstantial evidence
Yes.
is that it was Zion, the issue of Polish Jewish.
Yes.
Could you hammer on that a little bit further, that he didn't get it because of that particular, you did touch on it. Could you hammer a little further just to make sure I got it?
Well, I think there's no absolute clarity that of who was responsible, but I think there is solid speculation that has some basis that there were some Zionist elements involved here at work, because they have been among his most persistent critics before the appointment and afterwards. Now, after he didn't exactly leave the study of Polish history, but he went on to write other books on other subjects. Then, of course, the Zionist opposition to him, which had been rather substantial all during this period, had subsided because he was not directly involved anymore in Polish history. And then more recently, he wrote a book on the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, that is the Polish uprising, not the Ghetto uprising. And that sort of marks his return, in a sense, to Polish history again.
Is he coming to the U.S. for any lectures? Could you let me know if that ever occurs?
Absolutely.
I'd like to interview him if he ever comes.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Matter of fact, if you don't mind, I'll email him about the interview.
Please.
And I will convey, your interest. And I could just share your email address with him.
No, please. If he ever comes to the
Yeah, and
U.S.
if you have, like, maybe more specifically to your address in Michigan, because you travel a lot, so maybe your address in Michigan and telephone number.
Okay, I would do that. One last question,
Yeah.
your heart, please. Just a general, why is the Polish Holocaust, quote, Holocaust, forgotten, per your book?
Well, I think it's the Polish aspects of the Holocaust have been forgotten because of the priority that has been given in our publication to the Jewish tragedy, and the perception that the media has had from that what happened during World War II was essentially a Jewish thing, and whatever else occurred was of minor significance. And I think we've been locked into this, inundation of literature, of movies, of media concentration on the Jewish aspects of the Holocaust, that there hasn't been any room. In other words, they have taken all the oxygen out. It's been suffocating. And well might people who are of non-Jewish backgrounds, who are still alive, who experienced that personally, who were either gypsies or who were Poles or Ukrainians or what have you, and not to have much said about their particular tragedy. And whenever it is said, it is usually said in a disparaging light, in a negative light. And so in that sense, it has been forgotten. When it is remembered in a fractured, fragmented, distorted way, that isn't really remembering it as it was. It's not even partially true, not even remotely true. And so we, as I said from beginning to end here, we have some real problems in this historiography of this period. And I don't see any easy exit from it and beginning a new day of looking at this problem, because we have vested interests involved. And once you have vested interests, you have what vested interests are most interested in. They're interested in power, position, and they're not going to relent. I think our best hope is that if we could get young historians, preferably who have no Jewish connections or even Polish connections, but have the language fluency that you need to work with the documents, that maybe someday we will get a more honest appraisal of this entire period.
I lied. Can I squeeze in a couple quick ones? I just remember two. I swear to God.
Right.
Why the selling of the Holocaust? That part of the title of your controversial paper, controversial for some.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Selling
Well, I used the selling of the Holocaust in connection with Gross's book. That's what I meant. Now, Professor Norman Finkelstein has gone into the Holocaust industry, and I think he has said it, and said it rather well. I used that title in connection with the Gross book because it falls in this category of selling this, putting the Holocaust at the very forefront, as it were, even if it meant taking an isolated incident in a remote part of Poland, where indeed there was some victimization, but not of the Jews, by Poles, but not nearly at the level that he indicated in his book. And because it is so badly flawed in so many ways, there can be nothing else here but a propagandistic view of history, not really an authentic attempt to look at this incident in a historical way without the sensationalism. It was just a big journalistic selling job.
Would you consider that book to be typical or representative of an entire genre?
Well, I don't know that I'd go that far. I think that, some of them border on that. I think this is an extreme example of that genre, but what is disturbing is that so many historians who have written, somewhat more restrained books have embraced it as some kind of, with such a, and I think it undermines their own credibility as historians. I mean, it's cited in bibliography since then. It's even noted, in the endnotes of some of these recent books.
It sounds like The Painted Bird. You're familiar with that now?
Yes, I am. By Jerzy.
I would ask you about that, but you're getting to last question. Have you read Professor Biskupski's Hollywood's War Against Poland?
I read an article which was a synopsis of the book that was contained in Robert Cherry's book.
I've interviewed him.
Yes.
And I've looked at, and my question to you is, again, if you don't have an opinion, fine.
Yeah.
But he discusses the issue of, Hollywood has long been founded by mostly Jews from Poland and Eastern Europe.
Right.
So the issue for me, and to him, but very, very delicately, is the fact that these individuals were Jews and from Poland, and that there was this negative portrayal of Poland.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a perspective on that?
No, I think it just, no, I really don't have much more
That's
to.
not your realm of...
No.
Okay. All right. Well, then you've been fantastic.